Technological and scientific discovery has historically driven the human race forward in small steps, each one building upon the next to create wondrous new possibilities. Sometimes, often, these possibilities are violent. No single discovery has brought the destruction of the entire human race sharply into the realm of possibility, save for one. Welcome to a brief overview. Today we're going to be going over nuclear fission, its history, how it works, and its implications for the future of the human race. Once again, I would like to urge you to look into this in detail on your own if you find it interesting. So much of what we're going to be talking about is exceptionally complicated when you get into the specifics of it, and I think having more people knowledgeable about nuclear energy can only be a good thing. One more quick preface, I won't be summarizing any of the math or formulas involved in nuclear fission, partly because it's very hard to talk about math without being able to see the diagrams and the formulas, partly because I don't understand the math. I'm talking about theories here today, and once again, if you want to understand or even just look at the math, please go look it up. Nuclear fission was the result of a bunch of those little baby scientific steps revolving around radioactivity. Each step wasn't a baby step per se, but the practical nature of early radioactivity compared to fission is like comparing the study of a bird's wing to the production of a Concorde jet. Late in the 19th century, Antoine-Henri Becquerel started playing with magnets and cameras. The way cameras worked at the time was that bright light would create an image on a specific kind of paper. It's a drastic oversimplification, but for our purposes it works. Then, Becquerel covered the paper with cloth to see if anything could get through the cloth and affect the paper in a similar way, but without any light. Something did. It was called uranium. This was the beginning of research into radioactivity. Radioactivity basically boils down to this. The nuclei of some elements are big and therefore unstable, and when they break down they create new, smaller elements as well as kinetic energy. This process was the result of a variety of research and refinement, mostly headed by Ernest Rutherford and Marie Curie. The amount of time it takes for the nuclei to break down is the element's half-life. Picture it like this. You have two balls, one made out of mud and one made out of concrete. The ball made out of mud is going to break much sooner than the one made out of concrete. That means it has a shorter half-life. When the mud ball does break, instead of breaking into two smaller pieces of mud, it breaks down into dirt and water. Now on its own, that little mud ball is pretty insignificant, but if you consider that each little particle of something like uranium is made up of millions of atoms, well, imagine instead of one little mud ball, you have millions of them. Suddenly it's a river of water and a dirt storm emerging from those balls, and that's dangerous. In a practical sense, those new elements give off different waves that screw with the cells and or DNA in your body, causing them to mutate or lose structure entirely. Since your whole body is made up of cells, well, without properly functioning cells, you don't have a properly functioning body. So that's the general idea of radiation, but what does that have to do with nuclear fission? Well, nuclear fission refers to the process of an atom splitting. When an atom splits, it generates radiation, which, as we know, consists of new elements and energy. It's very rare for fission to take place naturally, so to achieve this split of the atom, the element is bombarded with subatomic particles. This provides the initial force to split the nuclei of the atom. But once the nuclei has been split, each half has a positive charge, because nuclei contain protons, which causes each half to be pushed away with far greater electromagnetic force. Picture taping the positive side of two magnets right together, and then taking a BB gun and shooting at the tape until it was split. Once the tape splits, the two magnets push away from each other. That's basically nuclear fission. Those two pieces of atom are then surrounded with more unstable atoms, and then when one atom is split, it bumps into two more atoms that split, which bump into more atoms, and so on and so forth. That's what's called a chain reaction, and the huge amount of radiation and energy that is released during a nuclear chain reaction is how humans can harness the power of the atom into bombs or power plants. Now, up until this point, this whole process may have seemed kind of dry, talking about particles, nuclei, and positive changes, and in a sense it is dry because radiation and nuclear fission were discovered by careful, considerate scientists. Although, funnily enough, a lot of regular people thought radiation must be good for you because it was new and fancy, so they would put radioactive materials into tonic waters and medicines and then, drink them. It was not healthy. Don't drink radioactive stuff, friends. The fun part about nuclear fission is the almost limitless potential for energy, and the staggering cooperation that it took to figure out fission and make it practical. The process of splitting an atom was discovered in Germany by a chemist named Otto Hahn in 1938, but one of his assistants, Lise Meitner, had to flee Germany because of her Jewish ancestry. She was able to correctly interpret the meaning and possibilities of Hahn's discovery, and her interpretation was picked up by Niels Bohr, the Nobel Prize winner for theorizing the structure of the atom. He went on to lecture at Princeton, and in 1939, the US had successfully split their first atom. It was at this point that a Hungarian physicist named Leo Szilard realized that fission could be used in a chain reaction he had theorized about 6 years earlier, and he urged his fellow researchers not to publish their findings because of the possibility it could be weaponized by the Nazis. Now this may be confusing because the man that had discovered fission was a German living in Germany, but as I mentioned earlier, there's a big difference between splitting a single atom and splitting a bunch. Well, Hahn had figured out how to split one atom, but chain reactions were figured out by different people in different places. But alas, the research was eventually published, and letters were penned from academics to governments warning about the potential for the other side to develop nuclear weapons. And because of all these governments being warned about other governments having nuclear weapons, they all started to try to figure out how to make nuclear weapons. I guess that's just how arms races tend to go. The US was able to win this particular race because it discovered that very pure graphite could be used as a moderator, which basically ensures the chain reaction continues without additional unstable elements like the comparatively rare and dangerous uranium. The Germans continued to use hard, aka irradiated water, which worked well in power plants, but didn't work properly in a small droppable bomb. The US had been researching nuclear fission weaponization since 1941, but they really cranked it up a year later with the beginning of the Manhattan Project under J. Robert Oppenheimer. Now before I began research for this episode, I thought Oppenheimer discovered fission and created nukes pretty much simultaneously and pretty much alone. This is obviously not even a little bit true, but I accredit it to the fact that Oppenheimer became kind of the face and voice of nuclear power because he led the team that created the capital B bomb. And because he was so against nuclear weapons despite creating the first one, Oppenheimer finally witnessed the destructive potential of nuclear energy, and he was not on board for it. Suddenly, this scientific project that had been trotted around the globe for a number of years was realized in a practical, tangible way, and it was terrifying. Still is terrifying. A kilogram of gasoline, the kind that is explosive enough to make your 1,000-pound car go will produce about 46 million joules of energy, which is quite a lot. A kilogram of natural uranium produces about 500 billion joules of energy, which sounds like a number you make up as a kid when you're trying to think of big numbers. Natural uranium is the most common element to use in nuclear reactions, used in an average light water reactor, so this is pretty much the bottom end of the nuclear energy scale. Even at its weakest, nuclear energy is 11,000 times more powerful. It makes sense why seeing that explode for the first time might give you a mild case of the willies, especially knowing your government was actively planning to drop it on real live people. The other fun part about dropping a nuke other than the explosion is the fallout, which is just the radiation we talked about earlier. Remember, like drowning, except in reality it's much longer and more painful because your cells mutate and split and stop doing their job, so your body becomes a horrific freak show of flesh that can no longer support any of the systems necessary for human life. So, if you're gonna die by nuclear bomb, make sure it's in the explosion. The experiments in labs and academia had been carried to the real world, and it's one of those technological cases that changes the world immediately and forever. Nuclear weapons are what launched us into the Cold War, because if both sides had not possessed the ability to entirely wipe out the other with one button, then the us and usser would have been able to take the old-fashioned route of shooting at each other and stealing ears or whatever it is militaries do. Instead, if anyone died, everyone would die, because we humans could finally make that happen. The weaponized power of nuclear fission is frankly astonishing, and the fact that only 2 nukes have ever been dropped on other humans is a dang mad miracle, especially considering how much more powerful modern nukes are than Little Boy and Fat Man. But there is another. With anything that can be weaponized comes a practical, peaceful use, and for fission, it's nuclear power plants. The same energy that goes into exploding a bomb can also be harnessed to power cities instead of leveling them. The chain reactions can be modified to happen at a much slower, controllable rate, and the electromagnetic force as well as the kinetic energy of the splitting atoms can be converted into electrical energy through a surprisingly simple process. That kinetic energy, like any other matter traveling at speed, creates friction, which in turn creates heat. In a nuclear reactor, that heat is captured by, well, water. Sorry, not well water, just regular water, which could be well water. Anyways, inside a nuclear reactor, it's basically just a steam engine, but with buttloads of radioactivity. When unstable elements like uranium are split, they generally turn into 2 different elements, both of which tend to be extremely radioactive and therefore harmful to humans without protection. These leftover elements are called nuclear waste. Despite the bogeyman that nuclear energy has turned into in recent years, nuclear waste can quite easily be stored until no longer radioactive, and produce none of the harmful fossil fuel byproducts that scientists have linked to our changing climate. Nuclear fuel like uranium still has to be mined like fossil fuels, but with the ratio of element to energy so high, it is unlikely we'll run out of fuel anytime soon. So why then are nuclear power plants so frequently talked about in hushed tones with faces of fear? One word, a name really, and I'm pretty sure you've already guessed it. The real scary part about nuclear power plants are that if they're mismanaged, they have the potential to melt down, which is basically a nuclear chain reaction that hits a point of critical mass and can no longer be contained by the safety measures of the facility. At which point there's nothing that can be done but let the reaction burn itself out and deal with the fallout. Boy, what fun. Chernobyl didn't happen just because it was a nuclear power plant. It also happened because the Soviet government made almost every single bad decision they possibly could, both while the plant was being designed and built, as well as while the fallout was occurring. That's a short version of Chernobyl, but once again, please for the love of God, go read or listen or watch even a little bit about Chernobyl. It's insane in every way you can imagine. Because of that disaster, many governments since have been wary of using fission to power much of anything, because no politician wants to nuke their own voters by accident. If politicians are going to nuke their voters, they're going to do it on purpose, and you're going to thank them for their sacrifice afterwards, god damn it. There have been some truly amazing precautions in the years since the Chernobyl meltdown, to the extent that during the massive earthquake and tsunami in Japan in 2011, their nuclear reactors were totally okay. Man, Japan really has a complicated relationship with nuclear fallout, and when I say complicated, I mean they hate it and will go to great lengths to prevent it, except of course surrendering at the end of a war they'd already lost. But Chernobyl did happen and revealed the truth, which is that nuclear power has the ability to wipe out massive portions of the human race within a tiny amount of time, whether intentional or not. Yes, the USSR mishandled the Chernobyl power plant, but what's going to stop another corrupt, broken system from building another faulty nuclear power plant and accidentally nuking half the globe? Even in political systems that aren't broken, bureaucracy and mismanagement is rampant enough to cause problems in regular forms of infrastructure. So do we trust them with this kind of power? But on the other side, do we want to continue spending huge amounts of time and resources building and maintaining less efficient sources of energy that are causing environmental problems? Another fun rabbit hole to dive into when you have the time is some of the branding and marketing of companies, especially American, in the 1950s. This is when the idea of the nuclear family began, because there was the very plausible belief that this new form of energy could be carried into everyday life, powering cars and homes, and so marketing ran with it as an ideal future tech, paired with the ideal straight white family. So Chernobyl put an end to the idea of household nuclear fission because, well, picture dum-dum Derek down the road, and then ask yourself if you want to give him the power to destroy your whole block. But nuclear power exists now, and we can't unsqueeze that tube. Countries have been building and refining so that now the ability to destroy each other or ourselves is much, much easier. But if the Cold War has proved anything, it's that even when two superpowers despise each other, nobody's all that interested in mutual destruction, and the constant threat of nuclear power has ushered in one of the longest eras of relative peace in a very, very long time. So is nuclear power a mistake? Are we courting disaster, or could it contribute to the next era of energy? Should we be expanding our nuclear programs or scaling them back? When you figure it out, let me know. In the meantime, thank you for listening. Feel free to check out some of the other episodes or just put this one on repeat. That's cool too. And hopefully, you'll stop by next time.